Hey everyone, Owen here, and today we're talking about one of my favorite games of all time, Splatoon. I don't actually keep the game in here. This is where I keep my copy of the Two Towers and spare change. Anyway though, Splatoon is arguably one of the best games to release in the past decade. In large part, that's obviously owed to its incredibly unique style and gameplay, qualities that won it the well-deserved titles of both Best Shooter and Best Multiplayer Game at the 2015 Game Awards. Its innovatively designed and excellently implemented mechanics, combined with refreshingly unique visuals and aesthetics, created one of the most definitive experiences in the shooter genre, perhaps of all time, and was a perfect proof of the idea that unique and even somewhat experimental experiences still had a place in a games industry trending towards highly realistic graphics and gameplay. But outside of all of those gameplay factors, there's another quality that has drawn many to the games and kept them invested. See, Splatoon, for all its colorful art and gameplay-focused design, actually has one of the deepest, most fascinating, and most relevant narratives of any recent game, one that is at times deeply poignant, critical, or even cynical. I'm not the first person, by any means, to discuss the lore of this series. Most if not all of the facts I'm going to talk about are pretty well known by the hardcore fans of the game. I'm not pretending to be an expert here. I've even seen some people allude to one or two of the ideas I'll be discussing, but I've never really seen anyone tying these individual points together in order to discuss the broader narrative at play in the games. So, without further ado, let's talk about the politics of Splatoon. Despite appearing to be some sort of alternate universe, being a near-carbon copy of our world but populated by anthropomorphic sea creatures, the world of Splatoon is actually the very same as our own, just set 12,000 years in the future in a period called the Mollusk Era. Much like our present human-created Anthropocene, which incidentally, according to some estimates, began roughly 12,000 years ago, the era is named for the species that dominate it. Humans are at this point long extinct after 5 world wars and a nuclear strike resulting in the complete melting of the Antarctic ice cap and subsequent worldwide flooding. Evidence of their civilization and apparent attempts to escape extinction are everywhere, from art to machines and structures to remains. The landscape is still shaped by the creations of the people who once inhabited it. And this setting of Splatoon's world being our future is highly critical, but we'll get back to that. As a result of this global flooding, sea life flourished, but when the sea levels began to recede again after 10,000 years, many species were forced to move onto the newly revealed land and evolved into humanoid forms. Over the next 2,000 years, these species, including the descendants of squid, octopi, prawns, and jellyfish, among others, developed into a society and culture heavily resembling our own. They have cities with skyscrapers, mobile phones, cars, video games, sports, and on a broader scale, concepts of states, what appears to be parliamentary legislatures, and of course markets and capitalism. And the similarities don't just stop there. The history of the society depicted in Splatoon is also very much reminiscent of our own. Much of the history that we're actively told about in the games has to do with an event known as the Great Turf War, where Octarians, descendants of the octopi, declared war on the Inklings, the descendants of squid and primary protagonists of the games, over the limited territory remaining on the land. The actual specifics of what the cultural situation before this war was are unclear, but the ultimate outcome was an Octarian defeat at the hands of the Inklings and their exile to underground cities, alongside Inkling occupation of the remaining territory on land. But that wasn't the end of the story, or even this conflict. Though their military and infrastructure was crippled to such a degree that waging direct war was no longer a viable option, the Octarians continued to the present day, that is, present within the context of the games, now fighting on a smaller scale with the Inklings over one of the few major energy sources remaining, the Great Zapfish. Through these events, and even more broadly, it's clear that Inkling history directly mirrors that of humans. From the early art of their civilization, which intended intentionally draws from the aesthetics of ancient human cultures to their recent past, which is characterized by the same kinds of conflict that we're seeing on our horizon and even today, and that within the game's context ultimately brought an end to human civilization, the parallels aren't difficult to draw. And it's not just coincidences that lead to these similarities between our world and that of Splatoon. The development of the society of the Inklings is heavily defined by interactions with what remains of human civilization, technology having been influenced by repurposed human creations, and certain human artifacts like this fax machine even have pseudo-religious significance. This isn't just a reflection of or an allegory for our world, it's a direct consequence of it. It's important to understand that the ills of Splatoon's world aren't just relegated to the past. While we've already touched on the contemporary conflicts over the Zapfish, another much larger scale conflict is simultaneously being waged, though this time not by a military but by paid workers, what essentially amounts to private military contractors. This is, of course, the ongoing state of armed combat between the Grizzco Corporation and the Salmonid species over power eggs, an energy commodity produced by the Salmonid. Now, an interesting question raised by this is, can this be called a war? Well, it's kind of difficult to say, actually. It is waged between two clearly intelligent groups, the Salmonid having been established as highly competent, even having created weapons trade treaties with the Octarians to outfit their soldiers. Their actions are very deliberate, and they have very strongly held values regarding conflict, with the culture of not fearing death and a history of combat with weapons. But it's not exactly a war in the way we would think of it today. For one side is a corporation operating exclusively for its own business interests. There's no illusion of a moral reason for the conflict. It's hard to even justify it as a defensive one. Sure, maybe the Salmonid would try to attack the mainland at some point, but if 4 contractors can handle dozens of them on their own, even with a massive attack, it'd be difficult to argue that the city couldn't defend itself to such a degree that they would have to engage in preemptive strikes. And even then, defense is explicitly not the goal of fighting the Salmonid, energy is. But I think it would be a mistake to think of the fact that this appears to be a largely offensive conflict on the part of the Inklings, and one for resources, and take away the idea that this isn't a war of some sort. Often, particularly in the United States, we like to think of war as being some inherently noble thing, or at least something that's non-selfish, either defending ourselves or our allies, or intervening for some selfless goal of defending democracy or the people of a given country. But when it comes down to it, these conflicts are, for the most part, fundamentally driven by self-interest and profit. Making the seizure of commodities the explicit goal of a conflict doesn't change what it fundamentally is, it's just saying the quiet part out loud. Wars over territory and resources are not only a fundamental formative element of Inkling history, but also a defining feature of their culture, to such a degree that their most popular sport, the Turf War, is essentially a small-scale reenactment of such past conflicts. Even the name of this game makes direct reference to the devastating territory war that happened within recent memory for many older Inklings. But, as we just saw, these conflicts aren't only relegated to the past, but rather an ongoing reality for Inkling society. The means and aesthetics of combat over territory and resources, both historical and contemporary, are commodified and repackaged into popular culture and leisure activities, while at the same time those very means are being used to wage the conflicts that those aesthetics replicate. In this way, military conflict is not only glorified, it is culturally embedded as an institution and a way of understanding the world. These aren't even just nondescript war games, they explicitly and intentionally resemble territorial conflicts, but sanitized, lacking the context of the wars they reference, reducing the objective to simply controlling as much territory as possible. Within the context of this representation of conflict, possession of more is a self-fulfilling goal. This sanitation, then, ultimately has the opposite effect to softening its representation, and in fact depicts and commodifies a much more dangerous version, again absent of any context present in their real-world counterparts. But the ways that the past is interpreted and altered in its representations in the present don't stop there. Despite the fact that they appear nearly, if not just as often as the Inklings, and are presented as being equal opponents in the conflicts they engage in, the Octarians and Octolings are rarely, if ever, actually considered outside of an unnuanced adversarial context. When fighting them in the first game, the conflict is explicitly over the Octarian kidnapping of the Great Sapfish, the energy source for the city of Inkopolis. While copious time is taken to stress how critical it is that it be returned to the city, not so much energy is used to examine why it was stolen to begin with. As we learn through indirect sources, because the subterranean cities the Inklings forced the Octarians into were failing and suffering energy shortages. Though they play less of a direct role, the Salmonid could also be considered here. They're an intelligent species with their own culture, goals, and needs. For the most part, neither the Salmonid nor Octarian militaries are forces that are particularly evil, at least in a unique way. But as is the case with many games, they are portrayed almost exclusively as homogeneous waves of enemies to mow down without a second thought. Where any attention is paid to the plight of these groups, and almost exclusively to the Octarians, it's always to individuals, never the group as a whole or their collective struggle. The Inklings are allowed to be represented to the audience through their civilian culture and life, but this is never afforded to any of these enemy groups, who are represented as a whole only through their militaries. This, in the player's eyes, turns these groups into, at best, militaries with a civilian population attached, rather than a civilian population with a military, as the Inklings are. Only one side is ever given the opportunity to not be seen through that lens. As a matter of fact, broadly, Splatoon does not dwell much on the plight of the Salmonid, or the Octarians, or the Octolings at all. We receive hints to the existence of more complex contexts and histories behind these enemy groups presented as ostensibly malicious, but these are never actually critically examined. As far as history goes, the accounts that we do have, which are almost exclusively of the Great Turf War, make allusions to Octarians being either unintelligent or exclusively malicious, or attribute the Inkling victory to superior biology. And these facts of the game's entirely uncritical examination of its history and world raises an interesting question. Do they reflect on the ideology of the game? Well, maybe. See, initially it might seem like the way that all of these things are presented means that the game is agreeing with those means of presentation and the implications that they have. After all, the game deliberately chooses to present all of this information in this way, from the perspective of the Inklings, so naturally that means it wants the audience to agree with this uncritical representation. But I think that when dealing with media criticism, it's very easy to fall into the trap of assuming that ideas that are presented are necessarily reflective of what the author thinks or wants you to take away. And I do agree that the point of view the game presents is very deliberate. What I disagree on is the idea that this necessarily means that the game wants us to agree with it. In Splatoon, the audience very much experiences and understands the game's world through the perspective of the Inklings. They are usually our main characters, sure, but the game also chooses to communicate almost every detail of the game from an in-universe perspective, and in-universe, the audience only sees, in any detail at least, an Inkling-centric culture. And with this fact in mind, we can recontextualize a lot of what we've discussed. Knowing that the historical accounts we see are in-universe and likely non-objective, it becomes clear that this isn't necessarily what the game wants us to think, it's telling us what the Inklings think. The plight of the Octarians and Salmonids aren't ignored because the game doesn't consider it to be important, but because the Inklings don't. Much in the same way that we learn about the Inklings and their culture through their glorification of the Turf War, we also learn about them through the ways that they present and describe themselves and others, and what they choose to leave out of those accounts. And none of these factors exist independently, they all interact with each other. The glorification of conflict in the Inklings themselves is fed by the disregard for the Octarians and Salmonids, and vice versa. And to be perfectly clear, none of this is meant to obfuscate the very real crimes that the Octarians commit against their own people. The Octarian military is a coercive institution that harms the Octarians themselves arguably more than the Inklings. But on top of that being unfortunately not unusual for a military force of any kind, it's also something deeply sad. The Octarians are left with few choices, really. Their society is failing, they have no energy, and lack even the resources to really attempt any actual military resolution. And again, that's not to excuse them, but there is a level of nuance to this story that never really gets considered in the games, and I think that in some ways, Splatoon wants to draw attention to these omissions. In a sense, the way that we understand the world of Splatoon is itself a condemnation of the society and culture we experience it through. Earlier, when we were discussing the story of Splatoon and touched on the fact that the games take place in the future of our world, I said that this was a very important detail, and I'd like to expand on that now. But to properly explain this, we'll have to briefly talk about the Octo Expansion. See, Splatoon 2 actually kind of has two separate stories. The first one, which was in the game when it released, is pretty similar to that of the first game, both in plot and structure. But roughly a year after release, the game received an update of unprecedented scale, including an entirely new story mode centered around, for the first time in the series' history, an Octoling protagonist. The story follows this character as they complete challenges in order to escape the Deep Sea Metro, a location that they found themselves in after they lost their memory, all the while directed in this quest by a mysterious telephone who tells them that they will be released when their goals have been met. But when the challenges have been completed and freedom seems near, it's revealed that it was all a lie. The telephone, who refers to itself as Commander Tartar, never had any intention of setting you free. All of the test subjects, including yourself, who was the 10,008th one, were only being selected to find the best performers who, rather than being released, would be killed and whose DNA would be used by Tartar to create the ultimate life form. And this concept, while not by any means unique to Splatoon, is as fascinating as it is terrifying. The player is presented already with a task that seems difficult, if not impossible, to complete. It's heavily implied that a very small number of subjects have ever actually triumphed, and the odds are stacked against them. But they begin with nothing, trapped, and are thus left with no choice as to whether or not they take on this challenge. However, despite all odds, they start winning. The player is told that if they only work hard enough, if they only strive enough, if they only win enough, that they can earn freedom from the cruel system they find themselves in. And trial after trial they complete, inching closer and closer to victory, freedom becoming more and more of a possibility until it's nearly a reality. But as the end is in sight, it's revealed, of course, that it was all a farce. Even if you do everything you can to earn your escape, in the end you'll be consumed by the system and a new subject will take your place. Either you lose and remain trapped, or win and are disposed of. Either way, the only winner is the system. You're trapped, and the only outcome is that it marches on. But this wasn't always what Tartar was meant to do. Near the end of the expansion story, we learned that the telephone was built not to harm the Inklings or Octarians, but to protect them. They were built by humans with the express purpose of retaining knowledge of the mistakes made by them and passing the history of those mistakes on to the next intelligent species to inhabit the Earth to prevent their repetition. But as we know, so far at least, this was a failed endeavor. Inkling society is a grim reflection of modern capitalist and consumerist tendencies and the conflicts that arise from them. The wars we fight, and as the game predicts, will fight over territory, energy, and other commodities, stain the history of those that inherited the Earth in the same way that they stain ours. The species of this new Earth have the same disregard for each other's well-being, the environment, and their future that we do. It was these facts that led Tartar to abandon their mission, believing that Inkling and Octarian societies were beyond saving. They had already gone too far down the same path that humans did. And while Tartar's testing and later last-ditch effort to destroy the planet were thwarted, these realities that they identified in Inkling and Octarian history and society very much remain. So, from this point, where does the story of Splatoon go? Well, I would argue that we already know where it goes. The game tells us. If the trajectory of history is maintained, it can only go one way. Capitalism and the innovations it claims to provide to us can't save us. Across the games, we see and learn about the ruins of spacecraft or cryogenic freezing chambers or underground cities, all incredible feats of technology brought about to meet the demands for ways for humans to escape the apocalypse. But all of them are failures. We still went extinct. Splatoon tells us that technology alone couldn't save us, and it won't save the people that came after us. And this makes the story of Splatoon an incredibly sad one. Modern society, in many ways, has conditioned us to believe that history is something that moves without fail in a progressive and self-improving manner. In part, this arises from blind confidence in capitalism as not only a self-regulatory entity, but also a self-protective one. That is to say that it will inevitably prevent its own collapse, and by extension, broader socio-political collapse, by always producing the technologies and outcomes necessary to its continuation. It also stems, I believe, from the politically advantageous idea, at least to moderate progressives, that we don't really have to take an active role in broad reforms. Insofar as they think such a thing would actually be necessary, they believe it will just sort of happen over the course of a vague time frame and many vague incremental steps, and oftentimes they don't even believe that that kind of reform is necessary because systemically we've got the broad strokes figured out already. We simultaneously exist on the infinite upward arc of history and at its end. But Splatoon posits that the idea of this inevitable arc of history is deeply flawed and even dangerous. The history of ourselves and that of the Earth after we're gone is still one history. Human influence didn't end when our species did, but this perfect arc kind of did. The very same things that led to the end of our species weren't learned from or moved beyond. They're being repeated. And the factors that led to that end are the very systems and ideas we think broadly are here to stay. But the games say that we can't afford for that to be the case. Today, we're very anxious about the future, and I would say that that's for good reason in a lot of cases. We're hurtling towards and are even seeing the initial stages of crisis in countless areas. The concept of energy or resource wars are quickly leaving the realm of anxieties for the future and becoming realities of the present. The climate crisis continues to snowball, with the countries of the world making symbolic gestures towards addressing it while still doing essentially nothing, decades after we needed to start in earnest. And the threat of world-destroying conflict continues to loom over us, as it has ever since we first invented the means by which we can utterly destroy ourselves. And, as with all art that deals with the aftermath of these crises coming to a head, Splatoon plays off of our cultural anxieties surrounding all of these issues. But the real horror of Splatoon isn't just that these things will happen, it's that nothing will ever come of it. Many today believe that it's possible a silver lining we can find in any crisis is the opportunity to incite change. And this is true in many cases. Both contemporarily and historically, we've seen repeatedly that when crises arise, people will look to alternatives to what they see as the root cause of that crisis. So maybe if we're lucky, we can use the climate crisis to radicalize people against capitalism. Maybe if there's a war, we can make people reconsider the way that the state operates and interacts with other states. But what if we don't get that chance? And what if we don't get people to recognize the correct reason? And worse yet, what if we do and it just doesn't work? Knowing what happened to us, and then watching those very same patterns play out in Inkling society is sad not only for them, but for us. There's a sense that we failed them as much as they did. But what if it doesn't have to end this way? Let's go back to the Octo Expansion. We left off with the player about to get blended by Tartar for the failures of their world, but obviously that's not how the story ends. In a final bid, the player realizes that it's not enough to labor and request that the system give you freedom. You have to take it for yourself. So you break out, bringing down that very system with you, and only then, at long last, emerging into the light. Is there a future for the world? Well, it might be too early to say. But I think that these games would say that there is if you're willing to make it happen. Splatoon is a lot of things. In many ways, it's an environmentalist story, urging us to take seriously the consequences of our actions. In others, it's a critique of capitalism and our culture, directing us to consider the implications of those systems. But I think most importantly, it's a story that tells you to take these things into your own hands. On its face, sure, Splatoon is a very tragic story, but it's also a very hopeful one, I think. We do have a future, so long as we decide that we want one. This is all I have. Please follow me on Patreon. That's a lie. Don't do that. I don't have a Patreon.